Welcome to the Carbon Accounting and Management Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Stainthorpe. This podcast is brought to you by Northstar Carbon and Impact, the carbon and sustainability management platform built by sustainability professionals for sustainability professionals. Northstar helps companies simplify GHG accounting, improve data quality, and stay audit ready across scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions so teams can spend less time reporting and more time driving real impact. Today, I'm joined by Brian Schoening, founder of One Small Step Sustainability Consulting and the GHG Shop. Brian's career is a masterclass in how to find the highest leverage work in sustainability. He started his career as an aerospace engineer at Northrop Grumman, but pivoted his career into corporate sustainability through a GHG analyst role at the company, where he learned quickly that in a large, complex organization, knowing what actually moves the needle matters more than trying to do everything at once. That focus on prioritizing impact became the foundation for everything that followed. From there, Brian used carbon accounting as a connecting thread, building out One Small Step Consulting to serve mid-market companies that need both strategic sustainability leadership and hands-on implementation support. He then moved into the fractional sustainability space and more recently launched the GHG Shop, a targeted practice focused specifically on GHG accounting support. Today, we're going to talk about what it takes to build a credible GHG inventory, the gaps Brian sees most often in practice, including cases where those gaps have led to inventories that simply weren't credible, and how to set up an inventory management plan that actually holds up. We'll also get into what it's like to operate as an independent consultant, building a portfolio of services, and how Brian focuses on driving impact, efficiency, and value with his carbon accounting work. Let's dive in. Brian, thanks so much for joining me today. Your career has taken you from designing fighter jets and satellites to corporate sustainability at one of the largest aerospace and defense contractors in the world, to running 2 complementary consulting practices focused on GHG accounting and sustainability leadership. Before we get into the details, can you give listeners a quick overview of your journey and what led you to build the practice you have today?
First of all, thanks, Aaron, for having me today. It's a pleasure to join the North Star Carbon podcast. And, my journey's been an interesting one over my 25-year career. As you said, I started as an aerospace engineer at Northrop Grumman. And, about 5 or 6 years in, I found kind of a new interest in sustainability. And I got really lucky and found a way to transition my career within Northrop by doing kind of part-time sustainability work, then taking a full-time carbon accounting analyst role as the company stood up its environmental sustainability function at the corporate level. Over the next 10 years, really kind of grew my role and took responsibility for that function, grew out the team, the responsibilities, and then stood up the corporate sustainability function for the company. And then right before I left the organization, we set up the 2030 goals for environmental sustainability. So I was at Northrop for nearly 20 years, and I've been in aerospace since college and really since I was a kid. In 2022 timeframe, we had just moved back to SoCal, came out of the pandemic, and I was just ready for a change, a new challenge, and realized I kind of needed to take some time off to figure out what that was. So I did a lot of soul searching, a lot of interviewing, picked up some interim projects in that time off, and realized I didn't want to go back big corporate. I didn't want to get siloed in one company again. And I really liked what I was seeing in the market, interviewing for different smaller companies that had some really interesting challenges at kind of that phase of an organization. So I kind of fell into the independent consulting piece and really decided like, this is where I can really balance having a diverse perspective, really get involved in a bunch of different industries, different projects, and also leverage this kind of really strong foundation of corporate sustainability building for kind of these more mid-market companies. So I jumped full into that in 2022, and it's been 4 years now, and I'm having a great time.
I think I had not fully appreciated Northrop Grumman was operating across hundreds of locations globally. And it seems like thinking at that scale is going to require a different set of tools than you're probably using right now for mid-market companies. So I was hoping you could help talk about how you developed that discipline of prioritization at Northrop Grumman, and then how that's helped you shape the way you work with clients today who are going to be smaller, but still really want to focus on efficiency and how to drive impact with the time they are spending on sustainability. So, what advice do you take from your work at Northrop Grumman that then you bring to clients today that is focused on that prioritization framework?
When I was in sustainability at Northrop, it was really a different era. It was a lot of voluntary action, and not as much on the regulatory customer pressure, especially in defense. So, and we were a defense company. So we were trying to keep up with the big tech companies and what they were doing, but we had a team of 3 people and a much more limited budget. So we had to really design a way that we could be a leader as a Fortune 100, company, but balance the prioritization that we're going to get within the company. And we had really strong leadership support for what we were doing. A couple of years later, let's do water, then waste. Let's do our first renewable energy large scale project. Like these are all just steps that you have to plan for over a little bit longer period of time than what you would like. So it becomes really strategic about where you place your efforts, get some near term wins that you can communicate to leadership, employees, other stakeholders, but have kind of that long term roadmap for how you're going to get to where you want to be. And I think that's where a lot of the small, medium sized businesses today are kind of struggling. They're coming at it from a requirements lens, a lot of customer expectations, what they have to do. And they're kind of overwhelmed with all of these requirements, but don't know how to time phase this into something that's reasonable. And then the really no budget. This is totally new. So they have to build a budget out for that.
And so then building off of that, really not having a budget, needing to think about something that might be new for them, having that focus on um, prioritization and the time phasing, you found has been very helpful for getting them to wrap their head around what their strategy should be.
Acronym soup for a lot of these companies, right? It's like, I need an SBTI, I need to do this, I have to respond to EcoVadis and CDP. And it's like, well, you can't do it all at once. Some of these are a multi-year journey and being very realistic with them of what can you do today? What can you push back on and say, I can't possibly do all this in year one. Can I do it in year two? I think is a really just open, transparent conversation to have at the onset of every project to really set expectations.
If I look at your career, Northrop Grumman, One Small Step, sustainability consulting, the fractional sustainability space, the GHG shop, carbon accounting is the red thread running through all of it. Why has GHG accounting specifically become the lens through which you approach sustainability work? And what does it mean for a mid market company to both need strategic sustainability leadership and technical carbon accounting support at the same time? Is that common that you would need both? And how do you handle it when both needs exist? But as you said, resources might be limited.
I really view carbon accounting as a starting point for a lot of companies. If you take EcoVadis as an example, a lot of those questions they can figure out, map to internal processes, like answer those. But then when you get to carbon accounting, they've never done it, never thought about it. It's the first thing they really think, I need expertise and I have to get someone to do this for me. You do their inventory, and maybe in the process, it's like, well, what's next? Oh, we have to do an SBTI. Oh, we have to do CDP. So it's just kind of the snowball effect, right? Is the starting point for where most companies will engage externally, I think, and then realize they could use a lot more support to build out, do better, and plan on some of these other requirements.
Well, I think just since we're talking about GHG inventories and it's always interesting to me to think about hopefully things go well, but there's times that we run into people in the past have done GHG accounting in different ways. And so I just wanted to ask, in the inventories that you've worked on, I know sometimes you've engaged with a client that's already done an inventory prior to coming on board. When maybe you've seen some red flags or an inventory that maybe hasn't met the credibility standard that we'd want to see. And so I don't want to name names. That's not about what we're doing here, but more just sharing experiences. Can you talk about a time when you opened up a client's inventory and realized that it wasn't credible or had significant issues that needed to be addressed? And when that happened, what were the warning signs that you saw where something had gone wrong in the process? And what was at stake for the company if they continued down that path, both with a technical failure and the business risk of having an inventory that's not credible?
Yeah, I've had a couple of instances where I've been surprised, but what I found when I started getting involved, and it's hard to pinpoint where the failure was in the process. I think you can attribute part of it to having an internal person that maybe didn't fully understand everything that was involved with carbon accounting to know what to provide the outside expert to do a proper inventory. And then I think also on the some of the consulting side, you might have a more junior person that's leading the engagement that hasn't been through tons of inventories or 10 years of inventories and all those lessons and trips and know what to ask to really get to the answer of what's there. So I've had one instance where pretty large company had completed a couple of years of inventory with a third party. And as I came in and reviewing their data, I started seeing some trending issues. So I started digging further and realized it was more of an inventory of data that was provided rather than the data that was needed to be complete. So if a site didn't provide data for the year, it was just a gap. They didn't estimate it. The bigger problem I saw was they were actually missing a large number of their locations in their inventory. And it required doing a full rebaseline of multiple years of data to close those gaps to say that we had a full, complete inventory to use as a baseline for goal setting, which was a new requirement for them. So they ran the risk of having a really incomplete inventory with a lot of gaps as a base year, and then improving the data over time, which means you're going to grow your inventory if you had less data when you started.
That's a pretty illuminating story to realize, it's not just the data that you have, but you want to have the complete data, right? And so if there's locations that are missing, that's a seems like an obvious gap, and it's definitely going to hurt thinking about decarbonization efforts or, as you said, trending. If you're then getting that data in the future and it looks like emissions are going up, when maybe you're just getting a more realistic sense of company operations.
Yeah. And with complex inventories, you're never going to have it all the first year. You're going to learn the first few years, but there is a process you can go through to make sure you have as much data that you should to start and that you estimate fill those gaps if you don't have it to get going.
Well, I don't want to dwell too much on failure points, although I actually feel like failure is often very illuminating and educational. And when we try to figure out what best practices should be. But when you think about some of those inventories you've looked at that had issues, I wanted to ask if there's any root causes that you see occurring frequently enough that it's a pattern worth flagging. And so for that, are you seeing data problems, problems with methodology, governance, or is it something else, right? I think you mentioned just even the experience of the inventory, the people leading the inventory process. So I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about what some of those root causes are when an inventory isn't complete or has credibility issues. And if you think any of those issues are different with the size of the business, thinking about a mid market company versus a company the size of Northrop Grumman, who, again, hundreds of locations around the world, there's probably just even larger data sets to try to compile and put into an inventory.
Yeah, I think expertise is really part of it. And kind of another issue that I saw in working with a client was they had an internal person that done their first inventory for them. And great for them, great initiative, right? They tried to do it, wasn't really using best practice. If you would have partnered them with someone just as for guidance, they could have maybe had a more complete inventory that they communicated externally. So I think the expertise part is really important. It's hard to not leverage an outside support for that specifically. I have a very complicated facility questionnaire for my clients of all of the buildings that you occupy. How big is it? Lease status? Let's figure out, does it have natural gas? Does it have anything else? Like, having that questionnaire structured really helps to make sure where you're seeing some gaps of what they don't know.
I wanted to ask about inventory management plans. And it feels like building one is oftentimes the key for getting GHG accounting right, for having documentation. But especially when you're starting with a client from scratch, like actually creating that inventory management plan can be quite a lift. So I wanted to ask if you had any guidance, particularly for practitioners who either may not have a formal IMP in place or maybe they have one that's out of date. What should the inventory management plan actually contain? And how should you think about that inventory management plan, not as just documenting the process, but almost protecting you from future scrutiny because you're actually able to make sure that it's a complete inventory?
Me, when I look at it, I think I always ask, who is my audience for this? And there's kind of multiple audiences that you need to consider as you're building this. You have your internal team, the person that you're working with right now, who might be a different person a year from now. So you need to make sure that you're tracking the internal processes sufficiently so you're supporting that transition for them. Leadership changes all the time in companies, and you never know how long your relationship will go. And then I think the third part is making sure that it's easy for an auditor to go through your inventory management plan, make sense of what you're doing, and efficiently accomplish your assurance review. So if you're putting too much fluff in there, copying images out of the greenhouse gas protocol, like, it's just hard for an auditor to go through. And you don't want to give them areas that they can trip. You want it to be simple, let them get through it and be done with it.
Speaking of that, I did want to also use this to talk about efficiency in GHG accounting because oftentimes in doing an engagement where you're looking at somebody's inventory, there's a tension between thoroughness and efficiency. Particularly, it feels like the demographic you're focused on right now is mid market companies. And oftentimes, I imagine they are cost conscious and don't want to afford to spend 6 months and a massive budget building their first inventory. So, using an efficiency mindset, how do you approach building something that's credible but is not going to take a ton of time and resources to build? Where would you focus first? And where would you tell clients that it's okay to use a rougher estimate or a simpler approach, at least at the starting point?
I think it's important to remember for these small, medium sized businesses that they're just getting started, but the expectations were developed by companies that have been doing this for a decade, right? So you can't get perfect from the start. And I think it's really important for companies to realize that this is a journey. Every company that's been reporting for years started somewhere. And you need to find that point for yourself with some flexibility and adaptability to like what's realistic for the moment. If you're just responding to a customer saying, I want your GHG data, then we can take a slightly different approach than if you're being required to do a third party assurance or set an SBTI that year, right? You have to think about the credibility of the data and what it's going to be used for that first year versus the second year. So oftentimes I'll start with a lot of focus on scope 1 and 2. Let's build that process and the relationships with the building managers, the landlords to get that data. And 1 or 2 engagements, if we don't get it, let's estimate it and move on. The scope 3 can be the monster, right? And I think precision here is the enemy of efficiency, especially when you're getting started. So I like to take more of a screening approach. So that really high level of more estimations of what these categories will be with some company specific data to give us an understanding of what's material and where we want to focus the next time, especially if this inventory is not being used for SBTI right away. Then get through the first one, go through your second, go back and fix anything that you learned the second time in your first year of inventory. But I think, like for category one, most companies have a strong P&L that's categorized that you can use, and that can check the box for a few scope three categories sometimes, at least for that initial screening process. And then something like waste and commuting, those two drive me crazy because they're never material. They're relevant, but they're not usually material for most companies. They haven't done an employee commuting survey and they can't get waste data from their landlords. So it's a lot of estimation there. So it's how detailed do you want to go to get 0.01% more accurate, right?
You shared that a lot of companies aren't coming to you because they want to be sustainability leaders. Oftentimes, their initial motivation is that they have a requirement to meet, whether it's a customer asking for their GHG data, a regulation kicking in, an investor questionnaire. So, I wanted to ask, when someone's coming because they have a requirement, how does that change your approach as a consultant? And do you find that meeting that requirement ever becomes the starting point for something more ambitious? Or if it starts in compliance mode, do you find that it usually stays in compliance mode?
This is one of the bigger lessons of going from running a program inside a company to being a consultant, right? Is as a consultant, you're really responding to the ask of the client and maybe nudging them a little bit, but you can't control near as much. So it's been an interesting transition working when most companies are driven by requirements right now. That's not super motivating and inspiring, but getting started is better than doing nothing. And honestly, many of the people that you work with in this that maybe raise their hand to say, I'll take on sustainability, they're interested, they want to learn, and they want to do more. So partnering with them is actually the fun part of the process of getting them educated, helping them navigate their company to figure out what can they do as an organization as they check the boxes along the way as they need to. But I have found as we grow the programs and the leadership engagement, the more people you talk to, really the more support you get. And even through one materiality assessment that I did for a client, we got up to the CEO interview. And he's like, I've been thinking about this, and that's why we're almost fully remote and, you know, XYZ. And it's really more that he just didn't know how else to implement it in his company. Right. Now we still have challenges to get it funded and move it forward, but you realize that there's more value here that you can create and connect some of these dots for the company and ultimately find really where's that unique place that a mid-market company can have the most impact. And that's where you start to nudge them down as they're doing what they have to do as the requirements.
At some point in your consulting practice, you evolved from doing traditional consulting and added fractional sustainability leadership to your work, which I think is a fascinating space, where you're essentially becoming a part time chief sustainability officer for multiple clients. I know last year you co founded the Fractional Sustainability Leaders Collective. And so I think for many of our listeners who are curious about the fractional model and also curious about what the collective is, I wanted to ask if you could speak to that and also why this is an important service for many mid market companies.
Yeah. To start, a fractional sustainability leader to the collective is really a part time sustainability leader. But the key word is leader. So it's really more of a senior level person that's probably done that role in house before and has the experience to really drive the strategy, but also implement the program. And I fell into the fractional role with one of my clients early on. I'm their part time head of sustainability, managing their ownership request, looking at how do we deal with EU regulations, customer disclosures. It's the same as I would be doing if I was at Northrop. I'm just doing it part time. And it's really helping the company build capacity to where they maybe are ready for the full time leader or have set enough in place to where you can hand it over then to, a full time senior leader to drive it forward. what I saw in that was like, this is a really impactful model for the mid-market companies. Most people are doing it of 10, 25% of their time, and it's not enough to really be effective. But you so by bringing in a senior leader that can really drive these programs, part-time, part the cost, you're really gaining that expertise plus the implementation support to drive consultant recommendations forward, customer requirements, really figure out how to integrate that into the company and maybe go from that box checking exercise to a little bit more strategic and long term thinking.
How does the collective play into that? Because I think then you're bringing together probably people who are doing that in different companies in different ways, and I imagine sharing best practices.
Yeah, so fractional has been around and it's very popular in finance world, operations, sales and marketing. It's not something you really hear about in sustainability. And there was a group of us that came together and realized like we're all interested in this, trying to push this forward and realized this is high impact for the industry and for our profession. And so we decided to create the collective to help bring some more focus to fractional as a model in the sustainability profession. But then also build a community of leaders that are trying to build their fractional businesses and learning from each other in that process of what does that look like? How is that different from our project-based consulting? How do they go together? And just having a community you can fall back onto, right? I think one of the big things that we did was put out a definition for fractional. So if people go to fslcollective.com, you'll see our formal definition for what is a fractional sustainability leader. And that aligns with the best practices of the Fractional Leader Alliance, which is kind of an umbrella for all fractionals, trying to set a more consistent definition of that and set it apart from what is a traditional consultant.
Well, I want to zoom back out and just thinking about the range of topics that we've covered in this conversation and some of your career trajectory. I am quite impressed that it seems like you have deliberately built multiple service lines into your consulting. And so we've talked about retainer work, project work, the GHG shop, and now fractional sustainability. Can you explain the logic behind having these multiple service lines? And for our listeners who are thinking about different careers in sustainability, how you think about this portfolio of different consulting services that you provide, kind of balancing your time, and how does that work as an independent consultant? I guess I was just hoping you could share any insights you might have and how that is probably different from working in the corporate world.
Yeah, there's a few reasons behind it. I think first, it's learning as I go. So I've learned more about who I am and where my unique value proposition is compared to other independents in the market. And then also, I'm learning what businesses really need as I engage with more and different clients. So that's also catering now how my services are most effective for that mid market. And consulting's highly variable, especially as an independent. I'm the pipeline, I'm the doer, I'm the accountant, I'm everything. So you have to kind of plan for that variability in your work. Fractional is a great base. Knowing I'm committed for a day and a half a week to a client for a year at a time, it's a fantastic base and comfort level that I can build from. But it also takes more mental capacity for me to be that strategic thought leader for the company. It's a little more mentally taxing. Whereas something like carbon accounting, I can do it in my sleep, really. And it's very time bound, it's predictable, it needs to be done. Then I have the project based work, whether it's helping with a disclosure, doing a materiality assessment. Some of that stuff can drag on, it can start and stop. It's highly variable. So by having these different buckets of services, I'm able to kind of manage my days, my weeks, my months, and build a portfolio where it's kind of sustaining for me financially and just in the amount of effort that I have to put in on a day to day basis.
Wow. Well, Brian, you've shared a lot with us on this call, and I think it's very impressive to think about how all those different um, consulting arrangements helps build together a career and one where you're really able to provide a lot of value to so many mid-market companies. I wanted to transition now into our closing sequence, which we call the implementation minute, and just think about high level takeaways that you would offer others. So I want you to imagine that it's Monday morning. A sustainability manager at a 200-person company just finished listening to this episode. They have a GHG inventory that was put together 2 years ago. They're not confident that it's credible, and they have a board meeting coming up where it's going to get scrutinized. What would you recommend they do as a next step after listening to this episode?
A couple things. One, validate each building. Know that you have every building accounted for. If you don't have data, estimate it. And don't assume that because you don't have data, it doesn't exist. And natural gas is an easy one where some buildings use it, some don't, and you never always know, but default to overestimating than under. And I think also go to the EPA emission factor hub. Make sure you're using that as your foundation for emission factors. Even if you use them for a different country, it's better than finding some abstract resource that isn't best practice. And I would say, second, find a partner. You don't have to outsource the work, but pay somebody an hour or two to look at your inventory and highlight some initial issues that you can go close if you really want a good fidelity of an inventory.
That seems like great advice. I wanted to follow that up by asking if there's a resource that you'd recommend, whether it's a tool, a framework, something from your own work, anything else that you think would help people think about GHG accounting and implementing better practices.
Personally, I think we need more simplification in carbon accounting, especially for this mid market. The groups like the Carbon Accounting Alliance, I think, are great. They're trying to bring people together, build a little bit more standardization than what the Greenhouse Gas Protocol provides, which is just high level. Their forums are great that you can engage with a lot of carbon accounting experts, bounce ideas off of each other. How are you doing this? How are you doing that? And I actually learned about it through the North Star podcast. But I think continuing to find forums like that and groups like that that are helping simplify the process for small and medium sized businesses. What a large, big tech company should do is very different than what a small B2B service company should do. And so those expectations need to vary. And I think we need to work on that from carbon accounting to disclosure to SBTI goal setting. It's hard when you get to the mid market.
Well, that is great advice. Before we wrap, I wanted to say a quick thank you to North Star Carbon and Impact for supporting this podcast. If you're looking for an easier, more transparent way to manage carbon and ESG data, prepare for audits, reporting, and decarbonization planning, please visit northstarcarbon.com to learn more or request a demo. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. Where can listeners connect with you if they want to learn more about One Small Step, the GHG shop, or even your fractional sustainability consulting work?
It's a lot of websites. LinkedIn is a great place to start. And then One Small Step Sustainability has out links to the ghgshop.com and the fslcollective.com.
Great. Well, thank you again. And for all our listeners, if this episode was valuable, please share your biggest takeaway on LinkedIn and tag us so we can continue the conversation there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron.